everyone. Welcome to a video that we wanted to create for some time. We've always used what you're about to see here in all of our sessions with parents. You'll see it in so many of my other talks that I've provided. But I wanted to create this video as a resource for parents who haven't heard us talk about the brain. So the brain and emotional development is always the foundation of everything that we do here at Relational Minds. All of our work is grounded in the evidence and science and neurobiology. So what you're about to hear next is the foundations of everything that we do, but also what I'm hoping it will give you is some ideas to help you understand the behaviors that your children are displaying, but also understand how your children are developing at each stage of their development according to their brain. So let's get to it. I'm going to share some images and talk to those, then we can talk together. So let's start with thinking about the levels of brain function. So it's useful for us to think about our brain as existing at three levels. So you'll see these colored red, blue, and green. At the basic lowest level, what we call a survival state, and others will refer to as the reptilian brain. This part of our brain, our brainstem, is really in charge of just keeping our body going. You might remember in some of the movies that it will say that they'll say someone is brain dead, which means that the vital organs are still functioning, but there's some tests that you can do that show that the rest of your brain is no longer alive, which means that you can function at these levels separate to the rest of the brain. So this really basic level is about maintaining body function. The next highest level is this emotional brain. So you'll hear this talked about as the limbic system, and this part of our system is what's common to all mammals. So this is the mammalian brain, and this is the emotional brain. It's in charge of keeping us safe. So emotions are our species' number one way of survival. By running away, by fighting, by freezing, by appeasing, this is our way of surviving. So that's the part of our brain that detects danger. That's the part of our brain that tells us that we need to do something because otherwise we might get hurt or we might have a negative outcome. Now, when we're born as a baby, we already have this part of our brain already well formed, because our babies and toddlers are very good at reacting to situations, being scared at situations. But what they're not good at is applying logic to situations, because that's the bit that is yet to develop. So this executive brain, or this high level of our brain, is in charge of making decisions, and it is what we call the fat controller, if you like, someone with a tank engine, or the conductor of the orchestra, because it connects to all the different brain systems to regulate that, to make decisions, and to help the rest of our brain function. So without our frontal lobe, our brain systems really occur on their own. They're not particularly good at being coordinated. So our frontal lobe is really, really important. Now, in our development, our brain will grow upwards and forwards. So this front part of our frontal lobe is one of the last to develop. And most of our studies show that in typical human beings, it might not finish developing till you're 25 years of age. So there's a lot of growth that needs to happen. So if you think about how your toddler or primary school age child will be functioning, these part of their brains really won't be that developed yet, which means that the part of their brain that will always be in charge is their emotional brain, that fight, flight, freeze. And what you'll see here, this is some slides of actual brain cells, is that from the newborn phase to the 2-year phase, there's a huge increase in brain connectivity and brain cell development. So these first few months in particular are really crucial, as well as the first 2 years. Now, what does that mean? Is that we're building cells, we're connecting cells, we're connecting brain systems. So that's going to be dependent on genetics, partly, so that genetics are going to decide how quickly these connections form, how quickly brain cells form. But then what we also know is that our experience will shape the direction of our development of our brain. So what that means is that if we look closer into the role of experience and how our brain develops, if we zoom in a bit more onto our brain, so that's a cut through our brain looking at the side, what we'll see is here's the brainstem, the emotional brain, and the frontal lobe. Let's now identify a few kind of key systems here. You guys will have heard about the amygdala. Your amygdala is your brain's smoke alarm or danger alarm. So that will activate the fight, flight, or freeze response, and that's responsible for making sure that you're safe. So what will happen is that all of our sensory stimuli through our senses will come up through a spinal cord, goes through this area called the thalamus, which is like a relay station that then gets sent out to other parts of the brain. So, for example, our sensory systems will send messages here to our somatosensory cortex, which decides whether that stimulus is a touch on our finger, or a smell, or a sight, or a sound. And that will then connect to other parts of the brain, including the frontal lobe, to make decisions or to interpret what that sensory signal is. So that happens in fractions of a second. Now, what we now know is that there are fibers that connect directly to the amygdala. So what you'll find is that your amygdala can fire and send off a danger signal before the rest of your brain even knows what's going on. So that's a reflexive response to keep us alive. But it also suggests that if our kids, in our children, if their brain connections aren't so efficient, that will kick in pretty quickly before their frontal lobe has an opportunity to regulate or think logically about a situation. So this will help explain to you why they react quite quickly before their brain can regulate. Now, so remember, our frontal lobe is in charge of regulation. So these fibers and networks need to build and grow. A lot of our research is focused on this area called the anterior cingulate, which is the anterior cingulate cortex, which is deep inside the frontal lobe. And now we also know that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is an important region of our frontal lobe to remember. This is where executive function seems to sit. So ADHD, attention, focus, planning, strategy, impulse control, they're all parts of our executive function. And so that's so far up the front that the development of that takes a while, which is why for our kids to develop systems where they can focus and make smarter decisions can take time. Right. And so these anterior cingulate systems seem to kick in a little bit earlier, but again, they're gonna need time to develop. Now, how does our experience shape this? Now, what we now know, so this is a chart from the polyvagal theory team that tells us that our fight, flight, freeze response, we can actually chart along a y and x axis depending on our arousal. So arousal might be another word for stress. So when stress levels are low, we'll be able to engage, we can experience joy, we can be in the present, we can be curious, we can be mindful and compassionate. And then normally a normal mood and arousal systems will fluctuate. Up and down. Sometimes we get a bit stressed, our frontal lobe regulates and say, okay, that's okay, we can come back down. But every now and then, we will get stressed enough that our arousal will increase. And the first stage we'll move into is this fight, flight part, or the sympathetic response. And as our stress levels increase, we can move from being worried and frustrated to being enraged or panicky, depending on whether it's a fight or flight. And then what we know is that we can then, if that stress or arousal continues to increase, and this can happen in fractions of a second, you move into this dissociative or numb or helpless state, which is driven by the other side of our nervous system called the dorsal vagal or the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, what happens here is that when you're dissociated, your attention systems are no longer awake. So you might be doing things, you might be saying things, but you won't realize what you're doing. And your kids, for example, a good example of this will be your kids will be doing something incredibly distressing, but then once the episode's over, they won't remember it, or they'll act like nothing's happened. And they genuinely were not aware. Now, it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that that memory wasn't stored, because it's still stored. Our brains always store things. It just means that the systems that was required for them to know and understand what was going on weren't online. Now, a good example of that, and one of the areas to focus on in this topic, is the hippocampus. So the hippocampus' job is to process and organize memory and experiences, right? So, for example, if we experience something right now, the hippocampus will compare that to previous memories and previous experiences. It will give us a context. It will tell us that it's happening right now, today, in this place. It will put a timestamp on your memories and tell you that this happened to you now, or so that later on when you remember, oh yeah, that happened to me a year ago. That's if your hippocampus is online. Now, there's something that we've learned about the hippocampus, is that when you get stressed, the hippocampus switches off. So what happens is, while you go through this, particularly in this dissociative state, you will be experiencing something, but there will be nothing that's organizing that experience or that into a memory for you. So what will happen, and this is what happens in PTSD, is that something will remind you of that experience a year down the track, and that memory will get brought up, but because it's not organized, your brain will re-experience it like it's happening again. And that's what flashbacks and re-experiencing is about with PTSD. And what else switches off? Okay. What we see is that now, when we go past this overwhelm, when if you sit in an MRI scanner that looks at your brain function, your frontal lobe also switches off. So all of these regulation mechanisms disappear. And this is even if you're an adult, right? If you're an adult, you get stressed enough, you'll do things that you won't remember. You won't, and because your frontal lobe's not online, you're not going to be able to think logically, to have a reasonable conversation, right? So what happens when your frontal lobe switches off? You act like a toddler, because that's what you had when you were a toddler, and that will always default. So when a high level of function switches off, we'll always revert back to the next lower level of function, which is a mammalian brain or emotional brain, which is what we had as a toddler. And then if you get stressed enough again, you can even switch to a lower level of function, which is your brainstem. And what you'll see here you might be emotional and reactive. Here you'll be curled up in a ball, needing to hide under a table or a chair. And we've seen many, many children do that. So that's what happens with stress. Now, let's keep going at this. So when your stress levels go up, your brain, your frontal lobe switches off, your hippocampus switches off. But all episodes of dysregulation, whether it's panic or anger, right, so fight or flight, all episodes of dysregulation will peak and then come back down again and deactivate every single time. Every time. Remember that. So every time your child's really struggling, your job is to get them through this peak phase to get back down till they can engage again. And you'll see that, right? Now, your job is to wait it out, to support them, to keep them safe, because what's happening when they're up here is that if they're functioning at this lower level, so for example, if they're functioning at the their frontal lobe, you can be logical, you can have a conversation, you can even have a debate. But if they're functioning at this more emotional level, then you'll need to soothe their emotions, like when they were a toddler. You wouldn't argue with your toddler. You wouldn't talk logic with your toddler. But if they're really functioning here, and these bits in between where they're completely exploding, then the best you can do is contain them in an environment, right? If they're smart enough and they're able to do it, and they have the systems to do it, they'll hide under a table. But sometimes you might just have to do what you can to keep yourself and them safe, because that's all you can do. There's no soothing. They won't even respond to you saying you love them. They won't respond to empathy at that point, because they're at this level where they're just really a raging animal that's feeling unsafe, and they need to get out of that cage or attack that cage that they're in. So let's remember that, right? This is a really, really crucial time. Now, remember, it all peak, right? So you need to look after yourself, and everybody needs to survive, because it will get better. However, there's an important part that you need to remember first. The road to deactivation is filled with shame and hopelessness. Okay, and you'll notice this. What you'll notice if you've got verbal children is that the words that they'll say here in this point will be lots of anger towards you, right? Anger towards objects. But then when they start to come down here, you'll start to hear the change in that tone, where the anger will become about them. They'll start to say things like, "I'm useless. I always do this." Right? That's a really, really crucial phase, because it's really hard when you're supporting them as a parent or a carer, is that you've just survived this horrible, distressing, dangerous section. And then the next phase for them is shame and hopelessness, where they need you the most. Right? You know, remember that phrase: the children who need the most love ask for love in the most unlovable ways. Now, that applies particular to kids in out of home care, but in all children and even adults. That's the time when we need the most help, are the times when we're pushing people away, the time when we've pushed them away because we need them away from us, because we're so shame filled, we're such horrible people that we need to remove ourselves from them or remove them from us. It's a really, really difficult period, which is why, for me, for all children, I worry less about the holes in the walls and the explosion, because we've got mechanisms to help with that, to keep people safe. Right? We can fix walls. We can call police and ambulance to go and find them when they're in this state. This is the bit that worries me, because this is the bit where they start. If that happens often, they will internalize that, and that will cause this problem to go on for longer. Okay, you might push them back up again. For example, if you haven't waited long enough to get down here, and you start saying things like, "Well, how can we have done that better?" You'll push them straight back up again. Right? This is the time. This is why, if I was going to say something to a parent, that this is not the time to intervene the most. This is the time to come in and say, "Hey, you really struggled there. You lost control. I'm still here. Okay, we're going to get through this." Because this is the crucial bit, is that our, our kids need to develop connections to be able to regulate their brain so that their frontal lobe doesn't switch off as often, right? But what happens if you've lived a life where your genetics suggest that the connections in your brain aren't so efficient, and you've lived a life that's where you've experienced a lot of times where your stress has increased a lot, where you've switched off your frontal lobe a lot, your brain has what we call a use it or lose it principle, which means the more stress you experience, even if your genetics are typical, the more stress you experience, the less developed your frontal lobe is going to be, or the delay it's going to be delayed in its development. So that's really, really crucial. Okay, to remember that what you find is you might have a 13-year-old who looks like a 13-year-old, talks like a 13-year-old, sounds like a 13-year-old, but when their emotions are kicking in, they act like a 5-year-old. Okay, and even as an adult, you'll have an adult who will become that, hopefully less frequently than a 13-year-old. A good way to simulate it is to drink alcohol, because that inhibits your frontal lobe. That will switch off, and you'll go back to being this reactive toddler again. Um, It's a really important thing to remember that every time you see difficult behaviors, this is what's happening. You're seeing these parts of your child's brain switch off. The stages that you can do to try and help them. So if you catch them here, then you might be able to give them empathy, right? Then that might help reduce this peak, and they might be able to come back down lower before losing control. But if they're up here, they're raging, that's not going to be useful anymore. Right. Up here, you might be able to nurture, up here, you might be able to nurture them, nurture their worry like you did when they were a toddler. But up here, they won't receive empathy. And down, and especially on this side, they hate themselves. That's when they're at risk of hurting themselves. So it's really, and at this point in time, they'll be really sensitive to what you look like, to what you say. And anything that pushes that shame will immediately cause them to react and go back up again. So it's a really, really tricky time, right? It's a tricky time for you. It's a tricky time for our families. Um, and there are certain conditions that we know can contribute to this. So we know that in humans who have autism, what we know about autism. We don't know heaps, and we certainly don't know everything, but we know some things. And one of the things that we do know is that connections between brain systems in autism are not so good at the long distance level. So when you need multiple brain parts to connect together, that seems to not develop so well. One of the things it seems to be good at is that local connection. So what you might find is that in someone who has autism, they'll be able to do some things really well because that's requiring a local circuit. But if you need them to integrate brain systems, like social communication that requires multiple brain parts, they will struggle. And in fact, if those integrations are not so good, that their brain will become overwhelmed and their amygdala will experience, will signal to them that this experience is dangerous, even though it's not, or it's typically not. And they'll resist you, they'll resist your demands, they'll fight your requests because they will experience that as dangerous, and they might move through this fight, freeze, shame cycle quicker than others, right? Which means that the development of their frontal lobe is going to be delayed because this is always going to be switching off, which means that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex development, executive function development is going to be delayed, which is why almost all kids with autism will also have ADHD, right? Because that's a delay in this development. So that's how you connect those different conditions together. So what do we do? Right? What can we do as parents and as carers who are helping our children? Number one, know which part of their brain that your child is using. So if they're functioning at this executive level, talk to them at the executive level. If they're functioning like a toddler, support them like a toddler. If they're here and they're not open to empathy and connection, then you need to keep them safe and provide them with containment. All right. That's number one. The second thing is, when we look at all the research that we've seen in babies and toddlers, is that human beings seem to have an innate mechanism of how to survive and how to regulate their emotions when these connections haven't formed yet. What is it? So what we know is that as babies, as toddlers, because we haven't built these regulatory mechanisms yet, we seem to have a system that we use where we can use another brain near us to regulate. It's what we call co-regulation, and the process is what we call referencing. So a baby who's upset or a toddler who's upset will look to their adult, look up at the adult and use the adult's presence, so their body language, their tone of voice, what they look like as a reference to help them decide whether this can calm or not. And it's not really a decision because the frontal lobe isn't formed yet to decide. It's even more special than that, that there's this connection between the carer or the parent and the child that will calm their system simply by being next to a calm, present brain. Okay, really, really crucial, and it's really important in that first few months of life. So, and so what we call is this referencing system is what we call attachment. All right, that your first attachment person is your mum, which is why we learn so much from our mum. Our mum's so important to us, but then we transfer that attachment to our dad and other adults, and even later on we might even transfer that to objects like a car or attachment objects that we like to touch, and be near. So what that tells us is that our brains have an innate way of learning how to regulate before our brains have developed. Okay, so what that means is that when our children's brains are dysregulated, or our children's brains are switched off in their frontal lobes, we can still use that system to help them regulate. Right? Now, the earlier that you can practice that, the earlier that you use that, the better that mechanism is going to work for you. Whereas if you're a foster carer and that child has learnt that people around them aren't actually going to be useful for them to reference, in fact, some of them might actually have hurt them, then that's going to take time to build that trust and that connection and that relationship for them to be able to use that. But even then, that might still work. Because we've worked in emergency departments, we've never met the child, and our presence can still help them calm. But also the presence of other people, or say our colleagues, who aren't very calm and who are not regulated themselves, they cause the kid to escalate again, right? Because they say the wrong thing, they look the wrong way, they have a different presence that causes that activates that child's defense response again. So it's important, right, that you trust that this peak is going to come, it's going to go, that your presence will actually help reduce the speed of that curve, might keep their brain connected, right? They're going to be, and if they, especially if you're the one they trust, that's going to be most important. Right. And if you're the one they trust, if you've already built trust with them, this section here, you're going to be crucial in this phase, because they're going to need you to say, hey, mate, that was really rough for you. You lost control there. Right. But that doesn't change who you are. You're still a good person and I'm still here. You haven't lost me. That's going to be crucial for them. Right. That's why these, some people call these soft approaches, right, don't work. Well, I'll tell you what doesn't work is that getting punitive responses, right, might get compliance from you from time to time, but certainly doesn't help your child's brain develop. Now, you know what? Child brains develop regardless, right? Even if even if they've gone through this terrible experiences, their brains will still grow. So eventually they're going to get better. It's just all the episodes of shame, the negative thoughts about themselves, the length of time that takes to get there. Because if we can help them regulate more often, then those brain networks are going to happen sooner. That's what we can do. So it means that even if your child's diagnosis is ADHD, your medication, what that does, and all medications, what it does is creates a chemical environment that helps these brain cells to connect together. But all it does is it creates the environment to allow those connections to happen. But they still need to fire. Those connections still need to grow. And so you still need that unconditional, trusting, connected environment and that relationship to help them in that growth. And if you can achieve that, right, you will find your child's ADHD improve so much quicker. You won't need medications for as long. Right? Those adults with ADHD and with medication, unfortunately, you probably didn't have those experiences when you were young, and you didn't have the help that you needed when you were younger to help you promote that. Right? Now, there's always going to be a balance of genetics and experience, right? So, and some of the experiential things are subtle, so it's always going to be hard to tell. But when you're an adult with ADHD and that part of your brain hasn't developed as well as you need it to, it will still get better, because I think all brains will still grow even to old age. The medications will help promote that connectivity, and you'll notice an improvement over time. But if you don't have, even as an adult, if you don't have a safe environment, you'll find that your medication won't work, right? Because your brain is constantly switching off. Your arousal levels are constantly high. So what does that teach us? All right. So let's recap. Right. Number one, we need to know which level of brain your child is functioning at, so that you can meet them at that level. Understand that arousal leads to this switching off, and so we need to accept that their behaviors are out of their control at that point. We're going to ride this wave and support them through shame, so that they can deactivate and be engaged again. Right? That's the thing. What's the hardest part about this? Is the fact that you need to stay regulated. Right? Your brain is exactly the same as your child's. And if you've had a difficult childhood, your brain can probably dysregulate just as quickly as theirs. So it's really, really important that you look after yourself, that you have people around you that creates for you a trusting and connected and accepting environment, so that your brain can stay regulated. And as much as possible, you have people around you take the load off and take pressure off you, so that your stress levels aren't as high, so that you don't dysregulate as often. Right? And even for us as clinicians who are supporting you, we need to remember that too. right? That we need to look after ourselves, because otherwise we won't be able to show you, we won't be able to be there for you, even at a distance. And look, we're even separate to what you're going through, right? So, but all human brains are the same, right? We have varying levels of genetic experience, genetic makeup in terms of our connectivity. We've got varying levels of how many times our frontal lobes have switched off because of the varying levels of stress that we've gone through in our childhood. But we're all the same. We all need to work together. This explains every human being in the world. Right? And you can think about this in your own experience, not just your child. So I'm hoping this has been helpful to you. Um, if you have any questions, then reach out to your family clinician. Our family clinicians will be able to work with you and help talk through how this can be applied. And there are certain principles that you can use to remember how to regulate and stay regulated with your child. And DDP and Dan Hughes teaches us about PACE, so playfulness, acceptance, curiosity, and empathy, as a structured way to remind us of how to create that calming environment. And it's useful. That's useful. It's a very useful attitude to keep reminding ourselves, because when our brain is starting to get anxious and starting to get stressed, we can anchor ourselves to that attitude and our principle to go, okay, this is what I'm going to use to help my child get through that peak. And the more times they experience someone helping them, the more they'll be able to trust you, and the more they'll be able to develop that mechanism themselves. Right. So that's why your role is so crucial, which is why at Relational Minds, people, we get criticism for, why are you always focusing on parents? What about the kid? Our child is the one who's got the problem. This is why it's so important, because without you and without our families, without our caring systems, we can't, it takes longer, right? We need to use more medications. We have more risks. It's that much harder without a trusting and accepting an empathic environment. This is why your role is so important, and we are committed to helping as many parents understand this and strengthen them and empowering them to know that they have such a crucial role. So our team can help you work through this. Our team can help you understand how this relates to your system. We've also got a few different um, methods or strategies or ways that can build on this, and that we can work on together, because we know that, remember, all kids' brains will develop. Everyone will get better. It's the risks and the pain that you go through in between that can change. And what we'd love is for all children to not have to go through as much pain to get to that period of development, and for all parents to not have to go through as much pain to help their child, because you love your child so much. So we're really grateful for the privilege and the opportunity to work with you. Please tell us and give us feedback at any time if there's things that aren't working out for you. We're really committed to making sure that you get a really good experience, and we're here to help as many parents as possible, here, there, and everywhere. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'll see you next time.